Welcome back to the Unexpected Podcast. My name is Justin Mahwikizi, and today's guest is Mr. Matthew Hoh, who has significant experience on the battlefield within the bureaucracy of Washington, D.C., but also in diplomacy. Matt, thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Justin. Thanks for having me join you.
Thank you. We'll just dive right into it. We're almost in the 52nd or 53rd day of the U.S.-Iran-Israel conflict. Generally speaking, can you tell us what you believe is the incentive structure of the Trump administration? Where is it going from a local politics perspective, but also from a future legacy perspective of a second-term president in his last term?
Right. So why are they doing this, and what do they hope to achieve? Right.
Correct.
And I think with this president in particular. Excuse me. With this president in particular, you do have a high degree of ego-driven policy, where this is about the president of the United States carrying out a war, carrying out policies that you can tie into the U.S. empire and hegemony and things like that, but also to have a very real personal interest and for Donald Trump, it's a lot about legacy, as you suggested, Justin. This idea that he would be the first president to really stand up to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Right, he was the only one who was willing to take them on. No one else is willing to do this. That type of ego, in the sense of that in the present, he is the only one able to do this sort of thing, but also to that identification with a legacy. So I think your question is spot on there, in that there are certain aspects of this that we can get into, the various interests that align to make a war like this a reality. Just the reality of the American empire. So the inertia that comes with those imperial pulses and impulses and needs and desires, but also too, there's the interest of Israel. There's the interest of the military-industrial complex. There's interest of the fossil fuel industry. There's interest of other groups, corporations, the tech industry that sees Iran as 93 million people who aren't on Facebook or X or TikTok. Right, so the idea of a untapped marketplace, but this intersect, yeah. So it is. So if that's where it dropped off about, so you have these other interests that align with the president who is willing to do this war, because those same interests have put pressure on previous presidents to carry out this war. Right. But this was the president who was willing to do it, and again, a lot of that's ego-driven.
Now, on the interest side, I understand, especially from an economic perspective, $90 million, people market. I could see that. But from the Israeli side, from Prime Minister Netanyahu's side, what's the calculus here? Is this a domestic politic issue with the investigations happening into him and his family? Or what's his real end goal here? Because it puts the Israelis, the citizens, at considerable risk.
Right. So, and this is why I think Netanyahu and Trump like each other so much, because they see each other in each other. Right. So the desire of Benjamin Netanyahu to use a war like this for his own personal purposes, to provide a constant emergency situation that Israel has been under for the last several years, that justifies all types of things, but it also helps him get out of his corruption trial. He was actually just supposed to testify last week, and he was able to be removed from that. He didn't have to testify. So certainly this war against Iran has proven popular, or is popular, in Israel, even though it's taking much longer than everyone said it was going to be, and the hardship of living in bunkers for all that time up until the ceasefire, the possibility of going back into the bunkers again, that's all there, but the war remains positive or popular. And for Netanyahu, of course, that is something that he can use for his own political purposes. And they're due for elections this year in Israel. Netanyahu wants to move those elections up as much as possible. The idea being, of course, that elections would occur within a time frame that it's, the end of this war bleeds into the elections, and
Yeah.
Netanyahu can use the success of the war, put success in quotes,
Right.
right, for his own political purposes. But there's also larger, broader is desires of Israel in all of this that go back decades. And this is the idea of removing Iran from the Middle East chessboard, if you will. I hate that description, but that's how a lot of people really do look at this. The idea being that if the Israelis are able to, with the Americans, are able to isolate Iran, or if they're able to make Iran into a dysfunctional country, that it cannot have impacts, it cannot have influence, it cannot interfere in other countries, or it cannot serve as a hedge or an obstacle to Israel's plans. That is what should be accomplished. And, those desires of the Israelis to do that, which is also seen in American strategy as well. And this is either in the Annan doctrine that goes back to the late 80s in Israel, or the American clean break strategy, which goes back to the early 90s. This idea of Israel not making peace with its neighbors, but rather dominating them. And Iran, as the biggest country, the biggest obstacle to that dominance, has to be removed. And so it can either be removed through regime change, which of course we've seen attempted, or just making Iran dysfunctional. And whether that is that Iran is so beaten down that it cannot do anything but try and heal itself, or I think, and this is how many Americans and Israelis see it, the idea being that Iran turns into a Syria or a Libya. And so the infighting there, the chaos, the instability, the civil war makes Iran completely incapable of having any effect, any power, any influence throughout the region. That means that Hezbollah no longer has support. The Houthis in Yemen no longer have support. The Iraqi resistance, the popular mobilization units in Iraq no longer have support. But most importantly for the Israelis, the Palestinians would not have support. So one of the things you can argue here is that for the Israelis, the Israeli perspective, and this is different than the American perspective, but the Israelis view the Iran war ultimately as a supporting effort, or a shaping effort, if you will, to their eventual annexation of the West Bank, right? The idea that if the Israelis ever want to fully annex the West Bank, which they are continuing to move towards, they will need to have Iran removed from the situation, from the picture, in order to ensure that the Palestinians are truly isolated. And you can make the same arguments as well for Hezbollah.
Right. But there's a serious miscalculation on, at least on the U.S. side, when it comes to Iran vis-a-vis Iraq, Libya, Syria, in the fact that you have a civilization that is cohesive, that is it's got an openness towards what solutions and how to persevere through troubled times. And they have an energy that goes, their history goes back thousands of years, and contribution to the culture of the world. And so do you think this was a big miscalculation, or they really understood there was a difference, but they wanted to take the risk regardless, where this is a different society that is better organized, willing to go through more hard times than the other counterparts we just mentioned, which has resulted in the U.S. Maritime dominance around that area, being essentially decimated, where we have ships going around Africa,
right,
rather than going through the Red Sea. And the UAE came to Washington this week to talk to Treasury and say, hey, we're going to need some foreign exchange swaps to support our economy, or we're going to have to start using Chinese yuan, just like Iran has done, taking yuan to let ship passes. So I know it's a convoluted question, but what type of calculations do you think the National Security Council went through, or our apparatus, before this decision was made?
I don't think there was much calculation at all, Justin. I think a lot of this was the inertia, the article of faith that has existed in Washington, D.C. for decades, that Iran is the true enemy of the United States, that other enemies tend to come and go, but the Iranians are always constant, for our lives, right? I think if you were to do a poll, not just of, say, the national security establishment, but of Americans in general, over the last 40 some odd years, and said, what are the top three adversaries or enemies or countries that are dangerous to the United States? There'd be countries coming in and out of that, right? Libya, Iraq, North Korea, et cetera.
Right.
But Iran, China, Russia, but Iran would always, I think, be a constant in that top three, because, particularly since 1979 in the hostage crisis there has been an obsession with Iran in American society, not just again in the national security establishment, but also throughout our media, throughout our culture, and so I think there's inertia there that, again, like I said earlier, was always pushing for this war. The belief in the national security establishment that an war with Iran was inevitable, much like as we hear about this discussion of the inevitability of a war with China, right? And that should really worry us.
Right.
But I don't think there was very much calculation involved here. I think it was seen as an inevitability. I think there was this inertia. Also, too, that the pressure from the Israelis on Donald Trump, the fact, again, that we had a president that's malleable, who was willing to do this when other presidents would not. And I think all these concerns that were clear, that were shown in one war game after another, or just through you have a decent conversation with somebody about what this could look like, and you and that other person are going to go through all of these scenarios. It's going to be obvious that this is what might happen. The vulnerability of the American bases in the region, it tied into the reality that Iran would be striking American allies. How would those countries react? Then alone, what is Iran's strongest weapon, if you will? Well, it will be economic warfare. Well, that wouldn't just impact the United States and Israel and Iran. That wouldn't just impact the region. That would impact the entire world. So if you were to go through this step by step, a lot of the reality of what we're seeing have played out over the last 6-7 weeks were eventualities that should have been taken into account, but don't seem to be. I think there's a lot that can be said here about the politicized nature of the national security planning system within the United States, the amateurish nature of it, the corruption within it, the fact that you do have an American foreign policy establishment, a national security establishment that is part of the military-industrial complex. There are very few jobs in Washington, D.C. on the issues that you and I are talking about here today that aren't in some way funded or at least vetted by the military-industrial complex. And I don't mean that to get a job someplace, Raytheon has to stamp your resume as saying approved, but it's just that there are very few positions throughout Washington, D.C. that haven't been influenced, that aren't funded, that don't have that connection in some way. And that's true in the think tanks. That's true in the media establishment. That's true both the congressional and executive branches. I mean, try and get a job as a staffer on a congressional committee for armed services or foreign relations. Where's your background going to have to come from? It's going to have to come from right out of the military or the intelligence services, or it's going to have to come out of some type of pipeline through academia and the think tanks that are more than likely funded by the military-industrial complex or adjacent to it in some way. So you have this environment, this ecosystem, where to have this type of conversation like you and I are having is heretical, right? To state the obvious of what the eventualities might be in a war like this, well, you're being negative, right? You're being pessimistic. You don't understand the big picture here. Or the word I would hear the most to describe like our conversation in Washington, D.C. is that Justin and Matt just simply aren't serious.
Right.
And what they mean by that is that Justin and Matt aren't serious about being employed, making $200,000 a year for so and so.
Right. No, what you're describing is the local Chicago banking community here.
Right. Yeah.
It's very tight knit, and they'll push through solutions that don't necessarily meet the requirements of the regulators. Come hell or high water, and if you speak against it, you're quickly blacklisted or do not hire lists, etc. So I fully understand that part.
Justin, I've said this before about history as well as other other industries or other idea that people would ask me, what should I read to understand the thinking behind the Iraq War and the Afghan War and how the Americans did that?
Yeah.
What should I read to understand that? And I say read David Halberstam's The Best and the Brightest, and Neil Shaheen's A Bright Shining Lie, both books about the Vietnam War. But I say if you read those books, you'll understand the Iraq and Afghan War. And I think you make the same argument. Go and watch the film The Big Short,
Yeah.
and you'll understand the Iraq War. Right? You'll understand that type of mindset, that hubris, that groupthink, the go along to get along type of mentality that exists in all organizations.
Correct.
But when you're talking about either big finance or
Yeah.
war, that type of reality is disastrous.
No, absolutely. On that same vein, from an escalation ladder perspective, do you believe that the ground war is inevitable at this point? Because the Trump administration is still moving assets as they're, quote unquote, negotiating. Is this a fait accompli, or there's still a chance of that not happening?
Well, I think a ground invasion a la Iraq in 1991 or 2003 just simply isn't possible because forces aren't there. One, the forces in the region, I mean, for the first Iraq war in 1990, 1991, there were over 500,000 U.S. and coalition forces. In 2003, there were 275,000, I believe. 175,000 Americans invaded, plus about 45,000 Brits and thousands of other coalition forces. So you simply now, with this plus up with the George H.W. Bush showing up, as well as the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, you're now at about 60,000 total forces. The vast majority of them are not ground combat forces. They're involved in aviation or logistics or supply or communications or on ships or what have you. So the actual footprint that's there, the force that could carry out some type of ground combat is minimal. It's also very light. There is a mechanized infantry brigade in Kuwait. It's been there since 1991, essentially. But its ability to do anything is limited. You have to have it cross the Afar Peninsula and the Shatt al-Arab, go through the swamps and the marshes, essentially, to invade southwestern Iraq, and Iran, and then you'd have probably 250,000 troops, too little. You have light infantry units there, those 2 Marine battalions that are there, plus you have elements of the 82nd Airborne Brigade, so paratroopers, and then you have thousands of special operations troops, but it's all very light. It's all small footprint. The reality of the distances there, the fact that the Americans had to evacuate most of their bases from the Gulf region, where would you even launch these types of operations from? And then how would you resupply them? How would you reinforce them? How would you evacuate them? So it doesn't seem that even if, and then if you were to put these light units onto the ground, onto an Iranian island or onto some part of the coastline, they're going to be very vulnerable to the missiles and drones that force the Americans to evacuate their bases in the first point. So, as well as, too, we can get into this if we want, my belief that the American military, the Marine Corps and the Army, is not to prepare. They're not prepared to fight in a modern war. That they're not ready, particularly, say, for a drone war. They don't have the doctrine. They don't have the equipment. They don't have leadership, the culture for that type of warfare. And so you'd be putting them under the open skies in unprepared ground where the Iranians want them to come into. The Iranians have clearly said, we want to see an American ground attack, plays into our strategy. If you go back and look at what the Iranians said they want to accomplish here, what their 3 objectives were, one was to create economic harm around the world, which they have. The second is to create political stress among America and its allies, not just the regional allies, but also, too, allies in Europe, allies in the Pacific. And then the third one is the causing American casualties. And the Iranians actually said out loud, we think if we could cause 500 American deaths, that would cause enough political problems domestically that such a war would be impossible in the future, right? So they've got 2 out of the 3 objectives. Why are you going to give them the ability to get the third objective? I mean, so none of it really makes sense, whether it's a concept of operations, whether it's the strategy, whether it's the fact that our troops aren't prepared for this. You'd be, again, putting them now not just within the risk of being attacked by, again, the same drones and missiles that chased us out of the bases that we had prepared for decades for such a war, but also too the shorter range drones and missiles that the Iranians haven't even employed yet. So I mean, like,
So
right,
you say escalation ladder,
right. I mean, like,
escalate
it's just,
room.
well, as you peel this onion apart, this just seems like a bad idea. Plus, too, if they get stuck and it goes bad, how do you pull them out? One, not just with the difficulty of the distances, okay, but also two, just the politics of it. If we put American Marines someplace or paratroopers someplace, and then it goes bad and we have to evacuate them, will the political decision be made to do that? Or will it be like Gallipoli or Quezon, right? Where those soldiers can't, or Marines can't evacuate because it'd be too politically problematic to do so. So then you're reinforcing failure. I mean, so you have all these things that you look at. So what I think, Justin, you'll end up seeing is you'll see what we saw yesterday or so, U.S. Marines boarding an Iranian ship, seizing it, right? You may see raids onto Iranian islands or parts of the Iranian coastline long enough to get a video of American Marines planting an American flag on a beach on Iran someplace. I think you probably see things like that, as well as raids that may have some purposes to hurt the Iranians economically, so sabotaging pipelines, things like that.
Yeah, but I think Iran is comfortable with that being the status quo because on the long term, with the midterm elections happening, whether there's casualties of American troops or $6 gas price in November, it's not a good picture for the Republicans, whichever way you look at it.
Right. I mean, that's why you wonder, why did they launch this war of choice? Right? Why did they launch this war that they don't seem like they're prepared for? They don't seem like they had all the. It seems as if they chose a date to launch it because they were able to kill Ayatollah Khamenei. That they had a good shot at him that day, so they launched the war, sooner than they wanted to. But even then, the idea being that this is a war that the United States was not prepared to wage in a sustained manner for months. So you have real issues within the American military in terms of whether it's maintenance, whether it's the number of ships and aircraft that are available, manpower issues, the ability of the American industry to manufacture the munitions on a time, in time for the American military to use them. You now have issues too that they should have seen coming, but they didn't. I don't know where they expected to refit their ships at. They had to evacuate the Persian Gulf, essentially. Yeah. So now the ships have to go all the way back to Diego Garcia. They can do underway replenishment, where people have seen the photos of a big tanker cargo type ship. It's got hoses connected to a destroyer or a frigate, so they're able to do those sorts of things. But unless they've figured it out in the last year or two, and I'm not aware of it, the missiles that you see firing from those destroyers, whether they be Tomahawk cruise missiles or the missiles like the SM-2 and SM-3s that shoot down Iranian drones and ballistic missiles, they come out of a system called the vertical launch system. And that can't be reloaded at sea. You have to go back to it, right? I mean, so what were they thinking they were going to do? They knew this was going to be a missile-heavy fight. They knew they were going to expend them all. Well, what's going to happen? So now you've got basically the entire American Navy having to rotate in and out, and you already have issues with maintenance. We have 10 aircraft carriers. Only 3 are able to be used right now. The other 7 are essentially all in the yards. I mean, we're months and months and months away from another aircraft carrier, unless, again, the U.S. Naval Institute press is wrong about this. I don't think they are, but we're months and months away from another carrier being able to join. And you've already got the Gerald Ford out there who is closing in on 11 months at sea with all the problems she had. And you look at this and you say, all this was known. All this you could put down in paper. And so their assumption must have been, this gets back to like your earlier question, that this was going to be quick. That this is, now I'm finally answering what you asked me before. The idea that the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro gave them such a shot of confidence.
That's really
right?
okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That, okay, we're going to assassinate the Israelis are saying it's going to happen. I know the New York Times is saying the Americans didn't say it. I guarantee you, John Ratcliffe at the CIA and others were also overly bullish in their estimation of the possibility of overthrowing a government in Iran. But the idea, we'll kill the Ayatollah, we'll kill a bunch of people around him, and then we'll make a few phone calls, and it'll be a turnkey operation, just like it was in Caracas. And to what you were saying before, how did they get that so wrong? This misestimation, the thought too that the Kurds were going to stage this uprising, or maybe the Azeris or the Baluchs.
That's right. I haven't heard about the Kurds ever since they told us that they were arming them.
That's right. So I think the Kurds, for people who are keeping score, I think the Kurds have been betrayed 8 times by the Americans in the last 40 some odd years. Yeah. The Nixon, for people who aren't familiar, the Nixon administration starts arming the Kurds in 1973.
Okay.
And then by 1975, Nixon and Kissinger have pulled that rug out from underneath the Kurds and are basically giving the Iraqis, who are now under the leadership of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party and everything, the permission to go north and slaughter the Kurds. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was the first of the betrayals that I'm aware of. And then since then, there's been 6, 7 other betrayals. Most recently, the one being this past year, where the Trump administration said to the Kurds in Syria, "You're no longer our guys. We're going with we're going with Ahmed al-Sharar's government in Damascus here." I mean, so I think the Kurds in Iran probably look into this saying, "Yeah, this is
another one."
Yeah, exactly.
This on the same chessboard.
Yeah, exactly. So, but it's staggering that we're sitting here talking about this, and the reality is, we were saying earlier, now we have ceasefire, we have J.D. Vance and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner going back to Islamabad, and we've seen the fruits of all their efforts. And so, why should we expect it to be anything different than what we've seen the last year and 4 months with them?
Right. I'm a student of the concept of the great game in the Middle East, and I'm trying to understand right now, what is Pakistan and Turkey's incentives? Because they have some interests in how this issue gets resolved. Do you think that's why Pakistan tried to be this type of a forum for negotiation? What are they looking to do? Those polar, on the east side you have Pakistan, and then you have Turkey, which also has an interest. Well, what are your thoughts on those two countries and how they see this issue?
Yeah, I think there's 2 elements to that. There's more practical, mundane things, like we got to stop this war because we don't want to see 5 million refugees coming across our borders, right? I mean, very practical, like this war is ruinous, it's disastrous. Economically, this is hurting us as much as it's hurting everyone else. In the Pakistanis, when it comes to energy, maybe even more so. There are practical concerns there, but there are also grander ideas. The Pakistanis understand themselves as a nation of almost 300 million people with nuclear weapons, a military that just did very well against India in the war last year, a relationship with China where Pakistan sees itself as maybe having some type of regional dominance, being a junior partner to China's power in the future, if you will, or maybe not even junior, but ancillary to that. Certainly, the relationship between the Pakistanis and the Trump administration, Donald Trump and Shehbaz Sharif, like when they see each other, they get excited. They do. You see these guys, they again, that type of, I think they understand each other. They see each other in themselves. Yeah. And the Turks have the same thing. I mean, they made the same thing for Erdogan and Trump. That's one of those romances that goes back, to the first term. But the Turks, same, having this idea of a bolder idea of where they should be in the world. These are countries that I think all see themselves as being not just regional powers, but potentially world powers. Iran is now a world power. I mean, you have this effect on the world by definition, you're a world power. And I think the Pakistanis and the the Turks say, yeah, makes sense. There's also too this idea of the hedge or the counter to Israel's desire for regional dominance.
Yeah.
The role that they see themselves in is not being Arabs. In a sense of being bookends to the Middle East. This kind of gets you back to Nixon's doctrine. His belief in having cops on the beat. So this is a bit nefarious, but the idea being that in the 70s, Nixon and Kissinger saw Israel and Iran under the Shah as being the bookends. I can't think of a better term
Yeah.
to the Middle East, basically kind of hedging in,
On
kind of
campus who
keeping
can try to, keep the nose down a little.
That's right. And in the middle, you have the Arabs, right?
Yeah.
So there is this,
I see it. Yeah.
right? I mean, and this goes back to the Brits. This goes back to what Ronald Storrs, who was the British governor in Jerusalem during the British Mandate in the 1920s, said about the British support for the Zionist movement, for the settlers coming from Europe to Palestine. This idea that we're creating a loyal Jewish Ulster in the midst of a potentially hostile sea of Arabism. And so there's concern about Arabism. And then, of course, the way that Nasser just freaked everybody out and he brought down the British Empire, essentially, right? And
literally,
right? I mean, like in that legacy is all there. That historical
all those
inertia
anxieties are
remains.
built into the program on both sides.
That's right. And so whether or not it's cognizant, you can now, and all the other reasons we're talking about Turkey and Pakistan, but we can see themselves as saying, as offering them up to the Americans as we can play that role here, right? At the same time, too, understanding that the world is changing, that we are in a multipolar world already, whether people want to admit it or not, but this growing need to establish new relationships, to have more modern relationships with other countries, as well as the roles that they feel they can play as the world changes, as the world order shifts. And so you see a lot about this Pakistani, Saudi, Turk, Egyptian, I don't want to call it alliance, but there are some things that are starting to get put down on paper between those countries.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this idea that they would be a bloc and that bloc would be powerful enough to dominate the Middle East or at least hedge any type of American-Israeli desires for dominance, as well as being a stabilizing influence, etc. And when they all bring different things, the Saudis bring money, the Pakistanis bring nuclear weapons, the Turks bring the largest army in NATO, except for the United States, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they complement each other. So this is a great question about what the Pakistanis and the Turks are trying to achieve here, because it gets into not just the proximate idea, right, the immediate need for someone to step in and do something about this, someone to step in and to mediate and to lead, but also too the bigger understanding of where the world is going. And I think this gets us to the point then about this conversation about the Iran war, how this is it will be, Justin, the war, the event that historians use to delineate the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century.
I agree.
Again, I just said multipolar world's already here, but historians like to have something upon which to close a chapter and
Yes.
right. And I think that's what you have here. You have the 20th century versus the 21st century. You have the American imperial order versus the multipolar world. And I think these nations realize this. And so that while they're trying to end the war, they're also recognizing this is an opportunity for us to establish ourselves in the new world order.
No, I agree. Actually, touched something on it when you talked about Pakistan and their relationship with China. I think there's almost 100,000 Chinese workers in Pakistan for the last few years. I forgot the region. And there's been skirmishes of locals not being happy those workers are there, and the Pakistani government are coordinating security with the Chinese government. So they're already they're having a bigger security relationship than before, especially vis-a-vis India on how to manage India. And so this is the timeline I'm seeing. Earlier this year, essentially, China won on the tariffs when the Supreme Court shut down Trump's tariffs. And very shortly afterwards, this issue happened with Iran, which impacted the flow of oil to China and their economy. So it slowed down regardless. In May, there's this meeting between President Trump and President Xi. And I wonder what's going to be on that table. It's going to be Iran, flow of oil, but China also has Taiwan as a key pillar they need to discuss with the United States. What do you think is going to be on the agenda on both sides, and what could come out of the meeting with President Xi and President Trump in May?
I think, from our perspective, we would look at this and say the Americans can come at this with the leverage of energy. And the Chinese are rapidly moving away from being dependent upon outside energy. I mean, a lot of statistics show that they're not. They have a lot of clean energy, right? But they still require 16 or 17 million barrels a day of oil to be imported. They still, right? They still need that fossil fuel, that legacy type of energy. But certainly 10, 15, 20 years from now, the Chinese are probably in a position where they say, we're energy independent. We're right. We're insulated. We're okay. But they're not there yet. So I think the Americans come in with that leverage, but the Chinese have greater leverage with the critical minerals. So I essentially I would like to see, because China, some measures controls about 90% of critical metals, minerals, magnets,
Processing, all of that, the whole infrastructure.
the whole thing. They don't have the actual raw resources. They have a lot of it, but they don't have the magnitude of it, the bulk of it. They import that, and then they process it, and I guess refine it, process it, however you describe it. And nobody else in the world does that, essentially, or it's very minimal. Again, the Chinese have about 90%. So they have that leverage, which the United States, whether it is our military, completely relying on it. All these missiles we're firing, the warships, the planes, those billion-dollar radar complexes that we saw the Iranians destroy with $20,000 drones, those can't be rebuilt without gallium and all the other things required, right? And who has that? The Chinese do. So if the Americans want to replenish, want to refit, want to rebuild their military after this war, if Donald Trump wants to make good on his $1.5 trillion Pentagon budget to build 500 ships in a Navy to go back to what Ronald Reagan had, you're going to need China's support with that. So both sides have leverage here. And I think the Chinese, watching how the Americans failed in their military, in their campaigns against the Houthis in Yemen, not once but twice. Both the Biden administration and the Trump administration failed to militarily open up the Red Sea. But then now this war, I think it's got to give the Chinese some confidence that the Americans can't defend Taiwan the way that the Americans have claimed that they can. I mean, it also would give me a great deal of pause if I was the Japanese and the South Koreans as well, because you're essentially looking at, essentially you becoming, either for Japan and South Korea, Australia to a lesser extent because of the distance, but the Philippines, of course, the idea that you will become what just happened to America's Gulf allies, but worse in a war with China. I mean, going into this, you have all this context, plus you have the Chinese understanding that there are a lot of senior Americans saying that this war isn't about Iran. It's not about Israel. It's about shutting down energy to the Chinese, that this war is about China, just as he had Americans saying that what happened in Venezuela was not about Venezuela or South America or the Western Hemisphere. This was about getting China out of South America. And you see that from prominent Americans. Rick Scott just said it again. Senator Rick Scott from Florida just said it again over the weekend.
Really?
Yeah, he said, I mean, his words were pretty straightforward. Essentially that take control of the Straits of Hormuz, cut off energy to China, and watch the Chinese economy collapse. I mean, so you have that context too coming into these talks about what this war has shown, not just in terms of the actual capacities or capability of the American military, but also too what the American leaders are thinking. So, I mean, I think for the Chinese, it's continuing to build going forward their idea of a fortress with gates, how they see themselves, seeing this war, seeing the nature of the Americans, the willingness of the Americans to engage in such warfare where this was, I'm sure the Chinese are the same thing as we are saying. Why didn't they see this coming? And so that's a really dangerous opponent. So now, again, this is about the third or fourth time I've referenced Richard Nixon, I think. Now you get to Nixon's madman theory, right? The idea that you throw your opponent, you throw your adversary, off guard, that you make them hesitant or you make them take risks because they can't contemplate what you're going to do because you've led them to believe that you're mad. Right. So Nixon and Kissinger saying if they think that we're crazy, then either they're not going to act or they're going to act hasty or make mistakes because they're afraid of us because we're crazy.
Right.
But that was calculated.
Yeah,
that was calculated. In this case, we actually have crazy leadership. Right. And so that must scare the hell out of
It's organic this time. Yes. Yeah. And by the way, even the U.S. citizens don't know what to expect. And so but I think you're right in how you just described it. Senator Rick Scott is typically a measured man, and so when he comes out and saying those things, there might be more to it than I thought. And at the same time, the leader of one of the three parties in Taiwan went to Beijing, and he was having a conversation with them. It was a woman. And so it looks like they're also anticipating something coming up in May. And so that's very interesting. You just said that. Last question, and because I'm cognizant of your time, unintended consequences. What can we expect from all of this in the States with oil prices the way it is, the economy the way it is, and how shaky our economy is? Tell our audience, not necessarily just on the geopolitical side, but on the U.S. economic side, what average citizens should expect and plan for.
Well, if it continues, I think if it ends, say we're wrong in our assumptions, and Galabaf and Vance hit it off Wednesday in Islamabad, and the war ends, you're still looking at months and months of delay in petroleum byproducts, natural gas, oil, of course, getting to the markets. So the sustained level of oil prices as well as natural gas prices, and then the issues with fertilizer, helium, all these ancillary byproducts of the petroleum industry, as well as in the second and third order effects of that inflation, that cost inflation, is still going to hit us. So even if I think if the war was to end Wednesday and there's a deal and the Straits of Hormuz are open, best case scenario occurs, right? You're still looking at the cost of this, the Americans feeling this, going into the midterm elections and possibly even up to the midterm elections.
Right.
Because by the time it takes to right this ship, if you will, this is one of the big fears that the oil industry had, or I should say the oil industry, but the fossil fuel industry had about any shutdown, was that when you shut down those production facilities, it takes a long time to get them back online. Right. But there's also the risk that you've done damage to the facilities, you've done damage to the wells, and there's the possibility that the wells won't produce, the reservoirs won't produce as they once did. So, you have that impact as well. And that's all best case, right? That's all best case, but then worst case, of course, is the idea that this continues at whatever degree, but essentially the Straits of Hormuz stays closed. And that's one thing to look at in the sense of, okay, a fifth of the world's oil and natural gas is off the market now, as well as the fertilizer, the helium, all those other things. And so you start to have real, not just inflation, but inflation's on the supply side. And so you have just an incapacity to meet any kind of demand. Correct. So then you have shortages, then you have rationing, right? And then you have industries stopping their business because they simply don't have the resources to do their business.
Correct.
Plus, as everyone knows, anything we own gets to us by truck, Right. I mean, so
Right.
the
Diesel
cost of
prices are
everything,
getting
so
up there.
diesel is $6 by me. I mean, so
Yeah.
$6 a gallon by me. So I have all that. But then you have the really scary aspect of this, Justin, is that say the war continues and they do start really striking each other's infrastructure. We saw some of that in the last month and a half. But say they really do destroy each other's infrastructure here, and now you're talking about not just the reality of a global recession, but potentially a depression. I mean, it's just not the idea of that sustained inavailability of petroleum and petroleum byproducts.
Right.
It is the reality that the Gulf money dries up. And you see Donald Trump all the time beating his chest about how much money foreign states are investing in the United States. And I think his numbers are way, way exaggerated.
Of
But
course.
it's true. The Gulf states have trillions of dollars invested in the United States. One of the things we saw, right, was with, and you probably talk about this much better than I can, but one of the things that usually at bad times like this, people go to gold and silver. But you
Correct.
saw gold, and so prices for gold and silver should go up. But you saw the opposite where you had sell-offs with gold and silver because of the potential loss of revenue, right? So you had large holders of gold and silver selling it to have cash on hand, right?
Correct.
I mean, so you have this reality that all this investment that the Gulf states have in the U.S., including a lot of it that powers where American growth is coming from, which is fixated on tech and AI and data centers, drying up.
It's drying
Right.
up and it's going to affect the capital markets as well, which
Right.
includes people's 401ks.
Yep. And then you have that cascading effect.
Yeah.
And then because you have this inflation that's, I don't care how high you raise interest rates, if there's no supply, I don't know what you do about that. Right. So you have that inflation, but then you also have this real severe downturn. And so then you have stagflation.
Correct.
Right. I mean, and so I think that is what you're looking at. I don't know if that technically leads you into a depression or not, but I think it could be that bad.
Well, it is because we have an outsized demand. We have the World Cup coming in. This is the 250th, celebration, everything happening.
Right.
And so that, man, it's got to be interesting.
Right. And then you have other, you got to then compound everything else, right? So then you have the reality that we have underinvested in ourselves for how long? Right? We've underinvested in ourselves in our education, in our healthcare, in our infrastructure. All that is coming due. We have high interest rates. My girlfriend and I are looking to buy a house right now. It's not the same market as it was last time I bought. I'll tell you that, right? I mean, so you're looking at all of that, the flight away from treasuries by, right? I mean, so where this thing as well, then you have the reality that the loss of the American dollar, the continued degradation of that as a reserve currency. You brought it up before, the idea of petro yuan rather than the petrodollar. Well, if the Americans lose that, if we lose that here, and now we're really talking big picture, kind of getting into longer term, but the idea we lose that and interest rates go up, right? Because we're trying to attract people to buy our debt. We can't, I mean, as well as the interest on that debt continues to accumulate, less services, less investment in ourselves, our infrastructure, education, healthcare, all those things. But then too, the dollar loses its value, which could actually happen, right? Even when you think those things
100%.
are contradictory, it still happen. It can happen. You have the dollar losing value, and now you're a nation of importers, right? We're a nation of consumers. We don't manufacture anything here, but our dollars lost value. I mean, you put all that together, and then you add in the other thing that we just seem like we've stopped talking about is climate change. And you have the reality of a couple of bad hurricanes every year wrecking the East Coast and drought in the West, right? I mean, those types of real harms that put strain on the infrastructure that's already been underinvested in, on a consumer base that has a lot less money than it had before. And then you're in a situation where this is how people say the American empire ends,
Well, Matthew, on that note, we're going to have to follow up with it. And please, as things change and there's some issues you want to talk about, we'd love to have you on here as well. Thank you for gracing us with your presence today. I think I learned a lot for sure, and I think our audience will as well. So I appreciate it, and thank you, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Justin.
All right.